My name is Nalin Pandey. I'm part of Scott's global leadership team at Global Support Services. Thank you for coming out to this session. We have an exciting session that Blair Doyle will be presenting on top 10 support issues. Can we have just a show of hands on how many customers have attended or have heard of customer support days before this? Great. So as Scott mentioned, these are some of our most popular sessions and they're based on feedback from customers. I hope you enjoy it. Blair?
Hello, everybody. My name is Blair Doyle, and what I'm talking about today is our top 10 support issues globally across all of our enterprise-level products. So we're going to hear a little bit about ESX, we're going to hear a little bit about Virtualization, we're going to hear a little bit about View, and maybe some other topics. The important thing to know about our top 10 support issues is that it can affect you in whether you're a small business or a large business. These are issues that could affect any one of us in our day-to-day operations using VMware products or any of the associated products. Now, the slide that I have up now, you've probably heard us talk about your journey to virtualization. This journey basically describes the entry-level journey where you're starting to virtualize your workloads, going into IT production workloads, moving into the business production workloads and virtualizing critical business production applications, or whether or not you're all the way through moving into treating IT as a service in a heavily virtualized environment. These topics could affect you regardless of where you are in the journey. Now, I want to take a moment to tell you I've been doing technical support for over 15 years, and I'm a firm believer that technical support isn't just a matter of fixing problems when they happen, but empowering you to have the information and the knowledge to either work around those issues and avoid them from happening altogether, or at least have the information so you know beforehand the types of problems that you might encounter to allow us to provide a quicker resolution to you. Now, when we're talking about top 10 support issues, the favorite quote that comes to mind is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if I was to tell you a problem that almost every one of our customers happen to encounter, before you encounter it, you will then know beforehand that you can actually do something about it without having to bang your head against a wall for days, weeks, hours, whatever the case might be. So I'm going to cover some topics here that just are frequent call generators to our support centers, and I think you'll be surprised at what the actual outcome is for some of our biggest call driving issues. Now, before I start, I want to get a raise of hands of who here is still running ESX 3.5? A good number. What about ESX 4.0? Along with vCenter 4.0? Okay. And how many customers are using View 3.x, 4.x, like say 4.0.x? Still got a few, right? Okay. So keep that in mind as I go through this slide deck, and hopefully you'll understand how we can help you to avoid some of the key issues that we get through. Now, the first topic we're going to talk about is vMotion CPU compatibility. Most of you should know that vMotion is a technology that we have that allows you to migrate running virtual machines from one ESX host to another while it's still operating. In order to do this, it takes a combination of working with live memory pages and CPU instructions and being able to transfer them from one physical host to another without interrupting the end user. And be able to do this multiple times in a scaled environment to be able to do concurrent vMotions at the same time. This is an exciting technology, and for myself, having the benefit of knowing all the intricacies that go into working on this technology and continually improving it, there's a lot of complexities there. For the end user, it's a click of the interface. Behind the scenes, there's a lot going on. And with that, the leading concern is CPU compatibility. Now, the CPUs that are out there, we have our major players, Intel and AMD, and the x86 platform. But each one has a variety of CPUs that they've come out with over the years, and we attempt to support them all. We want to make sure that they all will, well, at least a majority of them will function on your ESX hosts and will enable vMotion in one way, shape, or form. The leading issue here is that when two different CPUs exist in a host cluster, say you've got an Intel cluster that you bought originally and it's using a Harpertown CPU, and then you went out and you bought a couple more hosts just recently and they're using the, say, the Westermere CPUs. The Westermere CPUs have newer feature sets. Your virtual machines running on these hosts will take advantage of those feature sets. But if you try and migrate them to a host that doesn't have those feature sets, odd behaviors might occur. Unpredictable behaviors might occur. And so for that reason, we want to bring everybody in line to have CPU compatibility. And our customers often call us when things go wrong because they read an article somewhere that told them they might want to use CPU masking in order to achieve this. What CPU masking is basically a method to alter those CPU feature sets in some of the CPU platforms per VM in order to allow that vMotion to succeed. So listening to this, we created something called EVC, Enhanced vMotion Compatibility. What we've done there is we've created a group of baselines that allow you to basically create a common feature set that both the older CPUs and the newer CPUs have in common. So when the virtual machine starts up, regardless of what host it's starting up on, you know it's going to have a compatible set of CPU feature sets. This is the way we've tested it. We have a benchmark for this, and this is the way to do it. Use EVC when you have to do this. Using CPU masks may get the job done, and we've encountered customers that have done this and said it's worked fine for months, for years, until all of a sudden they built a new VM, a different kind of workload. Maybe it's the first time they virtualized Exchange. Maybe it's the first time they built a VM with Domino server, something unique to their environment. And all of a sudden, this VM doesn't vMotion properly with these settings. But because our customers have been using this successfully with CPU masks for so long, they don't identify that as a concern. Where it takes us, and oftentimes days or weeks of troubleshooting, to identify that that is the root cause that's happened. EVC will ensure that you have compatible vMotion capabilities across your hosts. And so avoid CPU masking, even though you have the option there. It is not supported. We do not recommend it. We cannot possibly guarantee successful vMotions when you're customizing with CPU masks. So use EVC. We put a lot of work in it, and we continue to. Another recommendation that I could offer you is that if you're planning and you know that your company is going to be virtualizing right now, you may only have a small environment right now. If you're going to buy servers to put in a cluster, buy groups of them. Similar CPUs, that way you can take advantage of all the feature sets that those CPUs have. If down the road you're going to upgrade to new servers or you want to expand your environment, buy another small group, create a new cluster, migrate your environment over there. When it's time to retire the old ones, then you can expand into that new environment. Or use EVC to consolidate through, understanding that the newer CPUs may have a baseline that does not allow you to use those newer feature sets. The good news is, the way the baselines are configured, for the majority of workloads, there's a negligible impact to your environment and the functionality of the VMs. And so you have the greater ability for DRS and for high availability information for and vMotion migrations, which greatly outweighs the minute performance impact or usability impact of not using those specific CPU feature sets in most workloads. The other side of things are the AMD architecture and the Intel architecture currently have no way to vMotion between them because they're so unique. So when at all possible, keep those separate to ensure that vMotions can be contained within an Intel cluster and within an AMD cluster. And before you ask the question, I have no information about vMotion compatibility between AMD and Intel at this time. The next issue we're going to talk about here is the vCenter database size. The main problem with that is that the virtual center database may grow very large. Now, the symptoms of that are the database files themselves growing large, or the transaction logs may grow large. You may get deadlocks when processing performance data that's visible through the performance graphs through vCenter when you're connected through the vSphere client. This can include gaps in the data. It can include no data being there at all, or purely the responsiveness when you're pulling up the different graphs in the different times. We have various recommendations that we can offer you for this, but the main takeaway is that as you start your environment, you may have a smaller inventory. You may have less features, less use of various statistical levels that you're using for performance graphs. And as it's smaller, things will run at a baseline that you become accustomed to. As your environment grows and as you add to the inventory, the demand on the virtual center server and the database server will also increase. So I ask that periodically revisit the resource utilizations of these services. Revisit the growth that you've experienced over the last months, years, etc. And understand that as the demand of your environment and as your demand of your business increases, so too do the resource demands. What we want to make sure of is that you can pay attention to the resource demands of the database server and the vCenter server, and understand that certain configurations within vCenter itself will have a direct role on the outcome and the demands of those resources. Very frequently we see statistical levels in the configuration of vCenter where you can bump up that statistical volume for the performance graphs. They come through levels 1 through 4, and 1 and 2 are perfect good standard operating procedures for those statistical volumes. However, because you see 3 or 4, you want more data, you want to get that granular information, you might bump it up, but that definitely increases the demand on your services. Our recommendation is to use the higher statistical levels as a specific debug mechanism. Use it when you're troubleshooting a specific problem. Turn it on temporarily in order to ascertain what it is you want to get out of that information and reduce it back down for general operations on a day-to-day basis. That will ensure that you do not have a backlog and you're not putting unneeded stress on your vCenter environment. Another thing to mention is regular database management and maintenance. Now, not everybody has the luxury of having a DBA or a separate database department that can look after that for you. Sometimes you're the only admin in the environment, or sometimes there's just a group of guys and you got to pick who's going to be the one to do the backups at midnight and who's going to be the one to perform this database maintenance that's kind of monotonous at times. But it's a necessary evil. If you take care of the maintenance, you do defragmentation on the indexes, you're going to make sure you have a healthy database. And this doesn't matter whether or not you're running in SQL, Oracle, DB2. They all need a little bit of TLC every once in a while to make sure things are going to run right. So we encourage you to stay up to date on that as well. And you'll be able to minimize the impact of, as your environment grows, of getting these increased in size to an unmanageable level where it impacts performance. Now this one here has been a hot topic for us since vCenter 4.0. And the reason for this, when you see vCenter shows high memory utilization for your virtual machines or for your hosts in the environment, the reason this started is because as of 4.0, when you have a CPU with a feature that allows you to present large pages through to your guest, we started automatically giving large memory pages through to every virtual machine that was powered on in an environment. So a lot of people got accustomed to using a metric called consumed memory or memory consumed, and that's what they would use as the sole basis to understand how is the memory being utilized in my environment. Am my ESX host using up all my memory? Well, when the transition from 3.5 to 4.0, it was a big shock for people that had the NetLM processors of the time and where large pages were in use. And this is purely an interpretation issue. There is not a problem here. It is the way the statistics are evaluated and reported back. Consumption alone tells you that this memory has been presented to your virtual machines in large pages, and sometimes that will be in greater excess than the actual true utilization or active memory in the ESX and in your virtual machines. The way to measure that, and the way our customers have described it to us, is I see high memory consumption on my ESX host when I'm monitoring it through vCenter. But when I look inside my Windows guest and I load up perfmon, I see I'm only using half a gig of RAM. It's low. Why is there this discrepancy? And I'll tell you, it's because ESX will continually grant large pages and only reclaim and break down those pages once there's actually memory contention in your environment. So use active memory in order to ascertain what the proper usage is. And if you want to be extra sure, check the swap in and swap out counters to see if whether or not you're actually swapping. Because there may be the odd time where you have a limit imposed on a VM that you forgot you put a memory limit on, and it's actually going to show an incorrect value, and it's going to be swapping out unneededly. So you do want to check swap in and swap out values. But by and large, this is all the way it's interpreted. So switch to using active memory. You'll definitely better understand things. We've also made adjustments to the way our alarms work in vCenter 4.1 in order to prevent false alarms when you see memory consumption. Initially in the 4.0 GA product, we did have an issue where these alarms were being thrown off because of this. We quickly addressed it in a patch. Another thing to note, if you so choose, you can disable large pages on the host. It's an advanced parameter. Please forget I told you, because we do not recommend that you do that. The performance benefit of using large pages far outweighs the need to look at an additional counter to understand the performance in your environment. We can see in some workloads greater than a 20% increase in performance purely by making use of large pages in this way, which is why we've gone in that direction. We take a little bit of confusion from what we've all gotten accustomed to using for performance metrics in exchange for actually getting better performance in the back end. So please don't disable it unless you just want to do it to test. We encourage you to keep it on in all cases. Now our next support issue here is, I'm sure a lot of us have seen this from time to time when you're first getting into configuring HA, when we see the VMware HA configuration failing. Now HA will fail when an HA agent has an error. Probably the least descriptive error you can see in vCenter. It doesn't give you a lot of detail about what's going on there. And that's why I feel it's a call generator. We're making steps to make sure those error messages are going to be more informative to you in the future. We want to make sure that if there's a problem relating to, as I've listed here, DNS Name Resolution, the one thing I was told earlier that I shouldn't bring up in this presentation. And I'll mention a second time, DNS Name Resolution. There you go. It is a common issue. And one thing we want to make sure of when you get these problems, that we do a better job of reporting back to you. So familiarize yourselves with the logging mechanisms that we have in vCenter, that we have on the ESX hosts. With these particular types of problems, you might want to look at the VPXD log on vCenter server. You might want to look at the VPXA log on the ESX host. You might want to look at the host D log on the ESX host, or VM kernel if it's classic ESX, or var log messages if it's ESXi. ESXi 5 will have VM kernel logs brought into it. So this log mechanism will give you that information in the background. We are making steps to bring that forward to you in a more visible sense through vCenter. You'll see us continually from the support side. We're fighting for you to bring what you guys want to the forefront of vCenter. vCenter 5 has some amazing error logging and collection capabilities that will help you and us to help you. So back to the HA configuration here, DNS name resolution, probably the most common reason. And I've seen it in two ways, where you have a DNS server that maybe just somebody updated it incorrectly, and one host's name is out of whack with the way it should be. But I would say, not necessarily commonly, but enough that it's tricky, and I feel like mentioning it, when you first start building an environment, maybe you haven't virtualized your DNS server. Maybe it's in your test environment and you don't have that connectivity to your production DNS server right now. So what we find users have done, they've gone into the ESX host, they've edited the etc host file, and they've statically assigned host name to IP resolutions in there for every one of their hosts in their environment and their vCenter server. Then what happens is they bring it over to production. They migrate things over. Maybe an IP address changed. Now your DNS server has the new updated IP address for that one host. And on one host out of your 6-host cluster has not been updated because it's statically assigned at the wrong IP in the etc host file. So it's something easy to overlook and very hard to identify unless you remember or you were the specific individual that went in there and configured it originally. And so we'll find that we stumble into this and say, oh, by the way, you have an etc host file edited. That's why you're not getting that resolution. We'll try and ping hosts from each other. Make sure that you have that kind of connectivity. And sometimes it could be a misspelling in the DNS server or in the etc host file. The other side is just plain network configuration. Do you have everything through the same route? Is it in the same subnet? Is it on the same gateway? You need to make sure that you have full connectivity between your hosts in order for HA to function, and it will fail if it doesn't meet the needs of that. The other side of things, which is often overlooked, is time configuration. Time being out of sync between vCenter and the ESX host, time being out of sync between host and host. These, depending on how far out of sync, can cause timeouts and interesting behavior when it comes to HA or AAM. And what we want to do here is make sure that your time settings are efficient. So my recommendation would be to configure an NTP server for your ESX hosts, and your vCenter server is probably going to be part of a domain, at least it should be, so it's probably going to use Win32 time to sync up with the domain controller, and then maybe you want that domain controller to sync up to the same NTP server as your ESX host to make sure you have that continuity, and that if something drifts on your NTP server, it's going to equally drift at least in your host to not break things. So you want to make sure that you have continuity and timekeeping in your environment. And that's something that, again, is not always blatantly obvious when you look, especially in an ESXi host where it's always showing you that GMT time zone, then your vCenters in your Eastern time zone, your Pacific time zone, whatever. And if you're like me, sometimes I just don't know what time zone I'm in and what the difference is, so you can overlook that quite easily. I've outlined a KB article at the bottom here. This KB article continually gets updated with every version, so you'll see information that may pertain to certain issues with older versions and new ones. You don't necessarily have to write it down. This presentation and all the other session presentations will be available at the end of the conference. We'll put them online on VMworld.com, so you'll be able to pick them up. Now, vCenter and ESX upgrade issues. These are wide and varied. So I'm not going to necessarily get into too many specifics here. Anybody who's been using VMware for a long time knows that we've got as many methods of upgrading as we do versions. So there are a lot of different ways that you can stumble into an upgrade issue or an installation issue. But at the most basic level, you want to make sure you read the release notes, read our installation guide. Make sure you understand that there are certain changes that will happen, such as our migration of vCenter to requiring a 64-bit operating system, or before that, requiring ESX to be installed on a 64-bit operating system. If you overlook that, this is a showstopper. You're not going to get past those limitations. You also want to make sure that you have enough resources before you perform your upgrade. Understand that newer versions may have additional space requirements that'll be detailed in their installation and upgrade guides. You also want to make sure that your database has sufficient space to handle the additional logging and work that's going to go on during an upgrade of your database. One of the other things to note is that we may retire support for certain versions of databases. We may add new support for other databases. Above all, back up your vCenter database before you perform an upgrade. The reason for that is we run a script to upgrade the tables in the database. If you encounter a problem where you've run out of space, we don't necessarily know where that upgrade failed, and we may not be able to recover that for you. That could be a hard stop for us, and it may be a hard stop for yourself. And depending on the size of your environment, it could be a very time-consuming thing to rebuild that inventory and your resource pools and get everything reconfigured. So pre-plan, make sure you've got the resources and everything in place, and you should do just fine. For a long time, we've recommended that you detach the SAN from your ESX host. And the reason for that is certain SAN configurations, certain disks will present themselves to the ESX host before the local storage. And our installer will find the first disk, and it's not going to be aware what that disk is used for, what file system's formatted on it, whether or not it's another ESX host or maybe it's a raw LUN for your Exchange server. It's not going to care. It will format it, overwrite it, and try and step on it. And for that reason, if you're not completely aware of the device IDs of the disks that you're going to purposely install or upgrade onto, you want to make sure that you can avoid it. An alternate would be to mask the LUNs out temporarily. Again, we have a KB article here that is continually updated with newer versions as they're released. Now, our ESX servers sometimes may show as not responding in vCenter. The ESX host may show not responding in vCenter, and the most common thing we find with our customers is that they'll reboot the host in order to get it back online. And sometimes this does the trick, sometimes it doesn't. But almost certainly, rebooting it and then wanting to find out why becomes a very difficult task for yourselves and for us. Because once the problem goes away, we may be able to see an error in the log to help you out, and you may be able to find a connectivity issue that you believe was the problem, but you're not necessarily going to know for sure. Our recommendation would always be, if you have direct console to the host, try and log into the host. See if it's actually responding directly to the console through SSH or direct through like a KVM, a DRAC, or an ILO. Once you're in there, you can try and restart the management services. Host D and all the other management services may come back up, or if they don't come up, they may tell you an error as to why. It also gives you an opportunity to go in and check the log files. We want to look for errors related to storage. We want to look for errors relating to maybe the service console's available memory if it's classic ESX. Maybe third-party interaction with SDK APIs or management agents, that sort of stuff that may be a drain on it or something got hung that host D relied on. And if you find that problem, restarting the agents may fix the problem for now, but at least you know what happened so you can look into it to see if maybe there's a bug. If it's third party, maybe you can contact your vendor and see if this is something that they should look out for. If it's a resource utilization issue in the service console, maybe you can bump up the memory on it in order to allow it to service better. And having that awareness is going to prevent this from reoccurring. Once it's already happened, it's happened. We can always do our best to get it back up, but knowing why it happened will help you prevent it from happening again in the future. And the logs are doing a very good job of giving you that information. And I would have to say from personal experience, storage errors are probably our leading factor. We're on to snapshots. Now, we have many misconceptions about snapshots. The number one of which, a lot of people tend to use them as backups. And this is not what they're intended for. They're intended for short-term use. They're intended for trying out a patch. Maybe you're doing a service pack upgrade. Maybe you are trying out a new configuration for your application and you're not sure if it's going to work right or not. You take a snapshot, you do your changes, you do your testing. Maybe it's over 12 hours, 24 hours, maybe even 3 or 4 or 5 days. But after that, you either give it a green light, the change was good, or a thumbs down, and you get rid of that snapshot. The reason being, these snapshots will grow over time. They're not contained within the same VMDK, they're contained in a sparse file external to the VMDK. It's going to track the changes that happen to the disk. And over time, those disks are going to grow larger. Those snapshot volumes are going to grow larger. And it might eat up the space that you have available on your data store. And you know what? To consolidate those snapshots, you need free space on your data store to do it. You may find yourself in a scenario where your snapshot is growing to gigs in size, and now you don't have enough free space on your volume to consolidate that snapshot. It puts you in a very difficult position. Your options are, at that point are extending that VMFS volume with an extent to give yourself the free space, or cloning that disk out to another LUN to consolidate that snapshot chain elsewhere. And that can cause downtime. And not to speak of, as your snapshots grow larger, performance can be impacted quite severely. So don't keep them around for a long time. They're not backups. When you're using a backup software, you might want to check in on your backup software to make sure it's not reporting errors, because sometimes backups will run, and when you're doing virtual machine backups, what it's essentially doing is it's taking a snapshot of that VM, is backing up the data, and it's consolidating that snapshot. We've seen plenty of times where the backup software itself is not completing that task properly. You end up with nested snapshot trees, where snapshots are no longer consolidating after the work is done. And then a couple days later, another backup job runs, and you get another snapshot going on. And next thing you know, you've got all these snapshots. I've seen them 20, 30 snapshots in a folder. And it's very difficult now to make sure you get them back down in the same order and make sure you get back down to that base disk. A less frequent but equally problematic and quite difficult to resolve is when you don't recognize what a snapshot file looks like, the VMDK file with a bunch of zeros at the end. Or you have moved that virtual machine manually through the console or through file copies, and you've somehow attached that base disk, not the snapshot, but the base disk, back to the virtual machine. Then you power on that virtual machine. The way snapshots work is they check the block change, and they always want to go back down to that base disk in the state of that base disk the way it was when that snapshot was created. If you boot your virtual machine off of that base disk, any reads and writes that you do can potentially change the geometry of that disk, preventing you from consolidating that chain down again, and you risk data corruption. If you encounter that scenario, call us. We do have ways to hopefully help you recover it. It's not a guarantee, but we do have practice that we can employ and help you get back running. certainly it's one of the more difficult scenarios to be in, and don't risk rebooting the machine again or trying to reattach the snapshots yourself unless you fully understand the way those chains work. And you will find a lot of public articles that describe that. All paths down. Now this slide here, I'm speaking about a very specific issue. Now this all paths down condition basically caused, this is say you retired a LUN, you decommissioned a LUN, but you didn't unpresent it to the ESX host. The ESX host continually tries to send I/O to this LUN to check to see if it's there. And what we were experiencing at this time was that virtual machines on unrelated volumes would go unresponsive because of this generated I/O. We've patched it. We've patched it in ESX 4.0p3. Now at the beginning of the presentation, I asked everybody, what do you run right now? Do you run 3.5? Do you run 4.0? Do you run, what versions are you running? You may notice a trend here that I'm talking about versions that are a couple back. I'm talking about patches that we have out for these things. And commonly we find that our users that are troubleshooting these problems for days or weeks aren't aware that we've already addressed these problems. They haven't checked the release notes. They haven't checked for the latest patches and what we're actually working on. We have two scenarios here. We've fixed the patch, or we know about it and we're working on it. And if you know that we know about it, you can give us a call and we can fill you in. We can give you a KB article that'll be updated as the patch development progresses. We have a subscribe feature in our knowledge base now that you can actually be updated as we update our articles. And that's a drive for us at the support side to make sure you can stay aware of all the issues that we're working on in order to stay up to date, whether it affects you or not. If you're just curious about a problem, subscribe to that article and we can keep you up to date. Now, the Kinect to View desktop problem. This is basically where a client cannot properly connect to the View connection server. The error that you get is cannot connect to desktop. And the external configuration issues are a normal cause for this problem when connecting to a desktop when it fails. This is network configuration or a firewall. These are the most common. This happens throughout all versions. This is a very typical network topology troubleshooting issue, and we spend a lot of time going through that. But the other side is that you may be using differing versions. Say you have a View client, and then you upgraded View, but you didn't upgrade your client. This could cause that problem. Could be the agent or the connection broker that are at differing versions, and that can cause the problem. But if you look at the View log files, it'll tell you if there's a version mismatch, if there's a connection reset by peer, or any of the other types of networking related errors that you get, and it points you in the direction of where you need to go to help isolate that problem. And we continually get calls of this nature, and a lot of the time, it's just a matter of getting a fresh set of eyes on the problem, because you may go through it yourself in your head and work on these problems for a while. Maybe you weren't aware that you could get logs out of View, or maybe you weren't fully understanding because you know if you RDP'd into it yourself, it worked. But then as soon as you use the View client, it didn't work so well. So you assume that it's the View client at fault, and sometimes it is, but other times it still could be networking. Now the last issue I'm going to talk about here is PC over IP multi-monitor configurations. This is another one where we have a lot of View customers that are using 4.0.x, Windows 7, and are configuring multi-display monitors. What you get is flickering monitors, or it wouldn't work. Now it was an experimental feature in that version, and we've added that fully functional into 4.5. Updating to that version will clearly address the issue for you. However, if you're still at the older version and you want to get it running, we can recommend that you increase video RAM. Usually multiples of 64 will help you out. Or confirm that the VMX file is properly configured to use 2 monitors. Or editing the default resolution and monitor configuration in the settings of the desktop pool within View. And that can help to correct things. Now, to summarize, each of these problems could certainly be encountered in your own infrastructure. And if identifying the most common problems allows you to anticipate them before they happen, you're going to save time, you're going to save a lot of frustration, and even if you do encounter them and you still can't get them resolved, we are more than happy to help you out. But at least you know that you have been armed with the information to at least make a better guess out of what these issues might be, make a better effort toward avoiding these problems in the future. And even if anything I showed here helps you with one problem, this has saved you some time and effort and certainly frustration. And then we've done our job. You also want to stay up to date with your patches and read release notes. As you notice, a lot of the calls that generate volume into our center are from older versions of the software. We're continually updating them, we're continually patching them, and we try and do our best to make the information public when we have a problem that we're working on and have not yet addressed. But we also try and let you know through mechanisms such as the release notes that these problems have been fixed in this version. So you can look, maybe you haven't encountered a problem yet, but you see we've released a new version. Check the release notes, have a browse, because next week you may have one of those problems and it'll ring in your head what it was. Yes?
I've had a lot of cases of issues before trying to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The difficult thing is you don't get VMware stepping in and saying, look, this is a known problem.
Right.
Not an official KV yet, but please bear with us. Driver update.
When we have issues that are in the middle of being investigated, when, say, it is something that we've had to go back to our engineering team on, there is a period of time where we're collecting information on the issue versus the time that we are prepared and understand the root cause of the issue well enough to portray it out to the public. So what we'll often do is we'll write a KB article and we'll keep it internal with the working understanding of the issue. And then we encourage you to open up a support case with us, describe the problem. If you've got a post in the forums where somebody that may be a VMware employee has said it's a known issue, by all means, point us to that link in the forum. We can look that user up, we can have that communication and connect those dots if the KB wasn't easily searchable. Perhaps you have a cryptic description of the problem and we can't find it internally because we have a vast knowledge base, right? But certainly if you get a SR open, we can go in the back channels and find that. And there is a time frame between creation and public revision because we want to make sure that we're putting out information that's accurate and that we fully understand the problem. We may go through a period of time where we're working on the assumption the problem is caused by this, and if we don't know that for sure, we're misinforming you. And so we'll hold that close until we're at that point in time. But we certainly will be very open with you through support mechanisms in order to make sure that you get the help that you need. Okay? Well, this brings me to the end of the session. If anybody has any questions, please see me or any of my colleagues over here. We'll be happy to help you out. Thank you very much.